All right, welcome back, everybody. Over to you, Greg.
All right. So, I guess let's move on and see how this week's exercise is going to unfold. So, from the Handbook for New Stoics, we're doing week 30, which is doing whatever political good you can. And for those of you who were here last week, Stoic Dan covered what in the book comes after this. It's the reserve clause, which is essentially training yourself to remind yourself constantly that any external goal that you pursue could go awry because it's not under your control. And by reminding yourself constantly about it, it hopefully sinks in that even though you're aiming to do useful things in the world, you may not always succeed, and that's not your fault. That's the nature of the thing. It's out of your complete control. And so that exercise, the reserve clause, is very useful for going into this week's exercise, which is why when Shrikant asked me to put together a basic selection of exercises, I actually switched them around, is because the reserve clause is useful going into doing whatever political good you can, which is week 30's exercise, and also the main thing that we're going to be exploring this week. And so we entitled this chapter using a quote from Seneca, and also using the word political to more in the ancient Greek sense of the term. So political comes from the Greek word polis, which means city or city-state, since the cities and the states were their own political entities back then. And so we are using it kind of in the way of trying to consider the greater good in some of your actions. It's not necessarily political in the modern sense of you having to put a campaign sign on your lawn or talking to a politician or donating to a political campaign. Although it is politics season in the United States, so those are actually things that you can do. It's just a subset of things you can do. It's not the only thing that we're asking you to try to do this week. We mean political in just taking into account your community around you, your polis, not necessarily lobbying a politician, for instance. And so this can be a hard thing to do, to get more socially active in the world around you. But the quote from Seneca kind of bolsters the idea that you can do something no matter what your position is. Seneca says that even in an oppressed state, the wise person can find an opportunity for bringing themselves to the front, which is essentially, we're using an old translation, but essentially that means like even if you are in a state of oppression or discomfort or like have physical limitations, there's something you can do to help somebody else out around you. And the goal of this week's exercise is to think about what you can do given your limitations and circumstances, and then try a bunch of stuff out. That is the exercise. What we recommend is actually sitting down and brainstorming a bunch of possibilities of what you can do in order to help those around you. And then you create a little menu for yourself, and each day you create a political action. Now, political actions can range, again, it's not just necessarily lobbying a politician. So some of the examples we give is like creating an implementation intention to do an act of kindness for a stranger. As a refresher, an implementation intention comes from a modern psychological technique of essentially trying to set a goal in terms of its trigger and what you're going to do. That's what an implementation is. And there's a lot of scientific research that suggests if you form a goal in this way, instead of the way most people form goals, that there's a higher chance you'll remember to do it. So an example for this is like, if you sit down and say, I'm going to do an act of kindness for a stranger this week, then that's it. That's a goal that you're likely to forget because you haven't spelled out the context in which you do it. And so what you could say is, when I'm in line for coffee, I will pay for the person's stuff behind me or in front of me. So that gives you a scenario. You're in line for coffee and you are paying for somebody's food behind you or in front of you. And so that gives you a circumstance and then a specific action that you are going to be doing. So forming your goals in that way raises the chances that you'll remember them when you're in the appropriate circumstance. Whereas just saying, I'm going to act more kindly, that's not necessarily going to help you actually remember to act when the time comes. So that's what an implementation intention is, as a refresher, or for those of you who are new to the book. But that's one thing you could do for political good, create an implementation intention to do an act of kindness for a stranger. And there are some other things. We also talk about researching effective charities on one day and then donating some money to an effective charity that also suits your values on the second day. So there are lots of things you can do. And we are suggesting for this entire week to think about different acts you can do and try them out in order to help those around you at a small or big level. And we ask you to take into account two things. The first thing is that you don't cause material harm to yourself when doing it, because you can just say, okay, I'm going to empty out my bank account and donate it to an effective charity. But presuming that you need that money to survive, live, and pay your rent, that may do material harm to yourself. So we want to draw boundaries so that your act of charity, generosity, or giving may be a little uncomfortable, but not so uncomfortable so that A, you'll be averse to it and fail, because we want you to be able to succeed. And so setting things that just stretch your boundaries a little is what's important here. And secondly, that you don't actually go so far as to do actually harm yourself by giving away everything or something like that. So that is one thing we want you to keep in mind when brainstorming possible actions of doing political good in the world. The second thing we want to keep in mind is if you are going to get political in the modern sense of the term, not in the ancient sense of just caring about your polis, your surroundings, the people around you, but the question we want to kind of ask is, how do you know that you're actually going to be acting for your own political good? Or other people's political good, as opposed to maybe bolstering a belief you already have? How do you know that maybe you are not acting selfishly because you care about how people perceive you, as opposed to genuinely acting in the other person's interest? We ask you to kind of ponder this in this week's exercise and to try to check yourself to make sure that when you act for others' benefit, you don't also have ulterior motives, like being seen as a generous person or impressing other people or, harming certain people because you think they're bad necessarily. To kind of keep those things in mind and think those things through. So with that being said, I think that this week's exercise is pretty straightforward. The hardest part is not understanding it, but doing it. To actually do a repeated exercise for the benefit of others every day, starting on Sunday or Monday through Saturday of next week till the next meeting. So actually following through is going to be the hardest part of this. But we want you to take some time also to brainstorm and think of what you're going to do, and then write out what action you're going to take on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then you could take notes afterwards and say, how did all that go? Did I fail at any points, and why do I think I failed? Did some actions make me feel better than others, and why that may be the case? Did I see any particular action that was really beneficial, where I saw somebody's lives get changed for the better, and did some action that I thought would be beneficial turn out not to be for that person or those people? Or do I even not know? Did I not get any information about it at all? In which case, it's an open question of how you know you're actually helping people if you're not getting any information back. One of the Stoic things to do is to use one's reasoning to try to adjust your beliefs on the fly about when new evidence comes in. And so if what you think you're doing to help other people is actually harming them, or you don't know, then that is something to take into account and to maybe adjust your actions based on it. And that is also a kind of it's a fundamental part of the discipline of action, to act intentionally and with reason, as opposed to just acting in a knee-jerk fashion based on your passions about how you feel something has to be right. The world of charity is littered with examples of charities that sounded good on paper and then turned out to be ineffective or cause downright harm. The one that immediately comes to mind is the DARE program of the 80s and I think maybe early 90s, where it really didn't work out too well and actually turned more kids to drugs at the end of the day. So when you actually looked at it. So those kinds of things are useful to keep in mind about whether you actually are doing any good. So checking your intentions and checking the efficacy is also useful. So with that being said, I'll just open it up to general questions and comments about the exercise, and then maybe we'll do one more breakout session when we're going to tackle a couple of open questions about this week's upcoming exercise. So with that, I'll hand it over to Shrikant, who can start maybe calling people, and if you want to raise your hand, Shrikant will tell you how.
Yes. So folks, this is your chance to ask questions. You can go ahead. There are four very simple rules of civility. To get to talk, go ahead and put an exclamation mark in chat, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anything, but do so courteously. All right, so who wants to go first? So we're going to start with Mark. But folks, go ahead and line up for questions. So it's going to be Mark followed by Wen. Mark, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciated what you said about questioning your passions with charitable donations and checking and being able to check the efficacy of your actions to see if they are doing what you want them to do and the results are going out the way you want. But my question is, in terms of like trying to be selfless, I always tend to then think about doing things anonymously. So then I can say, well, I'm not seeking recognition from others because I'm not letting anybody know I'm doing it. But then on the other hand, I run into the problem that I can't see the results of my actions. I was wondering if you had any advice about that challenge.
Well, since this is a week of experimentation, if you go through the exercise as we recommend it, you could actually do both and see. In fact, you could try to do something similarly where you can take a situation where you could be anonymous in one and a similar situation where you wouldn't be anonymous in another and see how it affects you. So you can make it into an experiment, and that's very much the spirit of this week's exercise, to experiment and see what works. But also sometimes, like, I guess if you donate, like I could donate, like there's a website in the United States that allows you to donate to people in need, GoFundMe. And you could donate anonymously and I still get updates as to how things are going on, even if I donate anonymously. So sometimes it may also be worth seeing whether that assumption is always true, that if you are anonymous, then you can't necessarily know the impact of the results. There are also charity evaluators that can tell you, like, we are pretty certain, like the big one that I'm aware of is givewell.org, which evaluates very high efficacy charities and looks at it very rigorously. So the charities they recommend, you can be as certain as you could be that their charity is going to be effective. So even if you donate to them anonymously, you could still have relatively high certainty that the charity you're donating to is going to use it well and actually change people's lives. Does that answer the question clearly, Mark?
That was very helpful. I like that idea about trying it in both ways and seeing the difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Next
up is Wen.
Okay, I agree. Setting out an intention to do good thing and literally, watch your action, and then. But I have problem with the result part also, and that the human beings are, although I think Stoics trying to be very keep life simple and put out a few outline or bullet points for us to follow, but human beings are indefinitely complicated, and your action, can create even a good action can create a web of a very different result, and it's not completely within your control, and then not to be seen within the short term. So how would I be able to gauge my action? And sometimes a good action can create very bad result.
Yeah, sometimes it can. I mean, and that's why the reserve clause is so important, because you go in with the intention to help others, but you also say that you actually may fail in that. A good Stoic would pay enough attention to adjust their course if there's strong evidence that they are causing harm instead of benefit. And secondly, a good Stoic recognizes that they're infallible. That's one of the key problems with the philosophy of utilitarianism. If you want to be exacting about it, it is hard to calculate all consequences. However, you can still take your best guess and do your epistemic due diligence of thinking things through clearly. That does not mean you'll always be right or perfect, but it means that on average you'll be doing a better job than if you didn't, I think.
Okay, next up is Caroline, followed by Joe. Caroline, go ahead.
Hello. So I kind of have a question regarding to go out and do this week. One thing that drives me absolutely crazy is like people on the internet that they're doing a good deed, but like they have to be recorded and they want it to be on, like put out there. How do you feel about that regarding this exercise? I mean, do you think that, it's just personally drives me nuts, but I didn't know if that's something that is okay, you know, as far as for the Stoics to do. I mean, I know it's not about getting the recognition, but I feel like something like the video, like recording and stuff is. So how do you, I guess, what are your views on that?
So I guess it depends, because there's the answer to what's the Stoic thing to do is always it depends, because a large part is a person's motivation. Sometimes people would post a charity they donated to on the internet, or them doing it in order to encourage other people to do so, or they may want to feel good about it, not being able to look inside their own minds from an external perspective. I can't tell either way what's really going on in their minds. And so the Stoic thing to do is to withhold judgment on other people in that case. As for yourself, you can see you have a better picture of what's going on in your own head. So if you check yourself and say, I'm going to post on the internet because I think this is a worthwhile cause, and me posting it will have more people donate to it, then maybe you would want to go ahead with it. If you are doing it because you're like, I can't do it unless I feel good, then it may be worth tackling the need for other people's approval before acting. And that's more in the discipline of desire. To train yourself to not be averse to people's judgments of you, or feel good about people's praise of you, and the other way around. The Stoic thing to do, and the point of the discipline of action, is to act with reason for what you best think is in the interest of others, but knowing that you could also be wrong. So that's kind of what I think of that in a nutshell.
Next up is Joe.
Yeah, just a really quick question. Would a way of maybe prioritizing what we give to be looking at as our roles in society and our roles as a Stoic? So basically, you know, a role as a son or a role as a citizen, and that would be kind of a way of maybe prioritizing what we should be giving time or money to.
Yes, that's a pretty important point, Joe, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because one of the things the Stoics emphasize that we didn't really talk about too much in this chapter, in the Handbook for New Stoics, is like that depending on who you are, you may be more personally effective at other things. So, for instance, if your mother, for instance, is upset about something, you would be in a better position to comfort your mother than me knocking on her door and saying, "Hey, I heard you're upset. I'm here to comfort you." Because you're their child. So you can do a lot more locally and within your own family and friend circle sometimes, because you're more familiar with them, you're in a proper position to help and all that. So another thing to keep in mind this week is, in terms of efficacy, is, are you particularly well suited or situationed so that you could help a particular person or group of people in your life just because of who you are and where you find yourself? Because I can't comfort your own mother as much as you can, probably. So that is a very important thing to keep in mind, and I appreciate you bringing it up, Joe.
All right, folks, if you have any more questions, I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. Otherwise, we are going to describe what we're going to do in the breakout rooms. Leslie, go ahead.
Thanks. Greg, I was hoping you could go back to what you said, that the Stoics' answer of, you know, it depends, is rooted in the idea of withholding judgment on other people. Does one of the chapters in your handbook speak most directly to withholding judgment on others?
Yeah, there's a couple within the discipline of action. Let me see if I could look it up. But there's a chapter, I forget which specific chapter it is, that talks about Marcus Aurelius's 10 different ways of coping with others in order to essentially experiment with trying to not necessarily leap to conclusions about others. I can't remember the specific chapter, but it's Marcus Aurelius he has two exercises, actually. One is like a big list of 10 different ways you can kind of work with or reframe how you view others' action. And one is specifically the morning meditation, where you wake up and say, I'm going to encounter these kinds of difficult people, but I'm here to work with them, not to work against them. So there are two exercises, and I'm having trouble finding the exact chapters right now, but those are the two that spring to mind.
Right. So Greg, can you describe what we're going to do in the breakout room?
Yeah. So I guess there are three things you could do, and I think depending on how your group wants to act, you can do any of the three or work through all three of them. So there are two big things that I mentioned to keep in mind while trying to come up with, brainstorm a list of possibly politically, in the ancient sense of the term, good things you can do. So those things are, again, drawing boundaries so that you don't do too much. And secondly, to see whether, to check your motivation to make sure you're doing it for others' benefit and not for other alternative motives. So the first thing I want you to discuss in the breakout rooms is, how can you actually do that? How can you check your motivation and see whether you are have ulterior motives or not? What ways can you actually do that? I said to do it, but it's an open question how. So how do you check your motivation? And also, how do you draw your boundaries? Where can you draw your boundaries of how much is too much, because you'll either increase the chance of failing or you may actually do material harm to yourself? So I'd like you to discuss that and focus on those two things. Again, how do you draw your boundaries and how do you check your own motivations? And if you have time, you may want to start brainstorming and sharing ideas of what to do this week to see what other people are doing, and you may get some ideas for yourself. So those are the two things: discuss how to check your motivations, check your limits, and secondly, come up with some ideas.
Excellent. So what we're going to do is that we're going to do breakout rooms for another 25 minutes, and then we're going to come back and share our takeaways.